Good morning. This hearing will come to order. Today's hearing is entitled The National Security Implications of Climate Change. The seeds of the Second World War and the Holocaust were sown in the worldwide depression of the 1930s. European democracies fell and were replaced with authoritarian regimes with repugnant ideologies. Last year, the British government issued a report that concluded that environmental devastation from global warming could result in a 5 to 20% decrease in the world's economic production, which would be comparable to the Great Depression or the World Wars. The report concluded that global warming could result in hunger from diminished agricultural production and fisheries, water shortages, epidemics, coastal flooding that could displace as many as 200 million people. Other experts argued that the report's conclusions were overstated and alarmist. But what if the report was right? Are we ready for the world we could face if the report's conclusions prove correct? Will environmental and economic devastation result in failed states, authoritarian regimes, the spread of extremism and terror, and warfare over scarce resources? Our national security professionals don't like surprises. They make it their business to anticipate events and plan for different contingencies, however unlikely. In the 40s and the 50s, we were frequently surprised when governments we thought were stable fell to coups or revolutions. Our intelligence community developed models to predict which societies were unstable or might become unstable. And contingency planning is second nature to our military. Few adversaries are polite enough to tell us in advance what their military plans are. Have we considered which societies may become unraveled as a result of environmental and economic devastation, whether or not we are certain that those results will materialize? The possibility of a world transformed by climate change is not a science fiction image of a post-apocalyptic society. It is not a Road Warrior movie. It is happening now. There is another Holocaust now in Darfur. The barbaric Bashir regime certainly is responsible for the genocide in Darfur, but the UN General Secretary Ban Ki-moon recently called the Darfur conflict an ecological crisis that had arisen at least in part from climate change. Arab tribes and African tribes lived together more or less in harmony for centuries, maybe millennia, but precipitation in what was already an arid region has declined by 40% in the last 2 decades. As the Sahara moved south into what had been sub-Sahara Africa. There is no longer enough water, both for Arab herders and for African farmers. The fighting in the Sudan has resulted in 400 to 450,000 deaths. 2.5 million people are living in refugee camps, and 4 million people in Darfur, about half the region's population, depend on food assistance to survive. How many struggling governments in developing nations will collapse from the economic consequences of global warming? Will those ungoverned regions become, to use General Anthony Zinni's phrase, petri dishes for extremism and terrorism? The consequences of global warming affect the work of many committees of this Congress. They have certainly been the subject of other hearings by the Science and Technology Committee. The national security implications of global warming certainly may guide the work of this committee. What research should we be doing that we're not doing already? What research should we move up in priority because of national security concerns? Can we be better prepared to protect our national security interest by conducting research that will predict what consequences can come from global warming and where? Can we be better prepared by conducting research into how to mitigate the consequences of global warming because the consequences are so dire, whether or not we are certain they will happen? To give just one example of the decisions this committee faces, this committee fought for years the decision to eliminate sensors designed to collect climate-related data from the INPO satellites, the National Polar Orbiting and Orbiting Operational Environmental Satellite System. The Department of Defense decided to eliminate the sensors to save money on what was already an embarrassingly large already embarrassingly large cost overruns, but was the elimination of those sensors short-sighted just on the basis of national security concerns and our national security needs? Each of our witnesses today will have 5 minutes to answer those questions. If you do not need the entire 5 minutes, of course, you may waive your time. And now I'll recognize Mr. Sensenbrenner for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the current thinking on the nature and magnitude of the threats that global warming may present to national security. I have experience with this issue. This April, I participated in a hearing on exactly the same topic before the Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming. The issue was not new to me then either. As chair of the Science Committee, I held numerous hearings on that topic. That I chaired related hearings is evidence that I believe it is important, but increasingly discussions about climate change are dominated by alarmism instead of common sense. As global warming has become more and more popular politically, predictions of the Earth's future have become more and more dire, and images of a world a degree warmer sound almost post-apocalyptic. Some of the scenarios I'm told we are destined to face include increased border and immigration stress on the United States from Mexico and the Caribbean, a widening wealth gap and fleeing of intellectual and financial elite within developing countries, increased poverty, floods, monsoons, melting glaciers, tropical cyclones, hurricanes, water contamination, ecosystem destruction, and political unrest throughout Asia and Europe, even a full-scale war between China and Russia. Education and understanding of the effects of global warming are critical, but sermons about an environmental apocalypse, while effective in rallying political support, ultimately monger fear, force a poor prioritization of resources, and threaten our ability to respond to more imminent threats. The national security risks posed by climate change need to be balanced against other threats and priorities. Climate change and its effect on national security have not exactly been ignored. As I mentioned, the Select Committee has already held an identical hearing. There have been a slew of books and policy papers, several of which will be discussed today. And most importantly, the intelligence community is already studying the issue. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence informed me that it expects to release an NIE on the issue in early 2008. Nonetheless, both the Senate and House are considering legislation that would force the DNI to submit that NIE that his office is already working on. Holding identical hearings and mandating reports that are already being written has more to do with politics than preparedness. This is not the first time someone has claimed the sky is falling. The predictions surrounding Y2K were similarly dire. Of course, this time it's different. Every time the sky falls, it's different, and every time those who advocate common sense are chastised for ignoring inescapable peril. Maybe it's my unswavering optimism that protects me from paranoia, or maybe it's just a lifetime of experience with dire prognostications. As unwise as it would be for us to ignore the national security implications of climate change, it is equally unwise to politicize our security to agree that we exaggerate certain threats and ignore others. Environmental consequences are not the only problems we have to address in our response to global warming. The other side of this challenge, the side that politicians and green extremists are reluctant to acknowledge, is that our energy demands are rising and will continue to rise. Running out of conventional power plants is a real threat. We need to find solutions like nuclear power that limit carbon emissions, but also ensure that our energy needs will be met. We are also facing unprecedented economic challenges. As the challenges of competing in the globalized economy mount, rapidly growing countries like China and India have made it clear again and again that they do not intend to hinder their economic growth to curb climate change. This means that any modest successes we enjoy at limiting our emissions will be completely offset by China and other nations. It also means that we cannot afford to stall our own economic development when other nations will not be similarly handicapped. Solutions that compromise our ability to produce energy or compete in the global economy will be disastrous for America's future. Fostering a more robust economy is our strongest defense against climate change. As the New York Times published an article called Feel Good versus Do Good on climate, the weather matters a lot less now than how people respond to it. According to the article, Robert Davis, a climatologist at the University of Virginia, concluded that the number of heat-related deaths in New York in the 1990s was 33% lower than in the 60s. It was not, of course, cooler in the 90s than it was in the 60s, but an increase in air conditioning saved lives. Because it is too late to prevent rising temperatures, the best response is to ensure our economy is strong enough to adequately respond. Everyone agrees that the wealthiest countries and individuals will be the least affected by global warming. Putting more people in a position to afford air conditioning will actually save lives. It has become controversial in today's warming political climate, but it is not outrageous to trust that American ingenuity can respond to this challenge as it has responded to challenges in the past. Preparedness demands that we consider how changing circumstances affect the overall picture of our national security, but ultimately solutions to global warming and the multitude of problems that it prevents will be solved by the scientific community and emerging technological industries. As policymakers, our focus should be on encouraging these industries, ensuring that our energy needs are met by sources that limit carbon emissions, and by responding to and anticipating problems engendered by climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Other members may submit written testimony for the record. And at this time, I would like to introduce our first panel, and it is an impressive, distinguished panel. General Gordon R. Sullivan is the former Chief of Staff of the United States Army and is currently the Chairman of the Military Advisory Board to the report by the CNA Corporation entitled National Security and the Threat of Climate Change. Mr. James Woolsey is the former Director of the Central Intelligence Agency and is currently Vice President at Booz Allen Hamilton. He is the author of a chapter in a forthcoming report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies entitled Potential Foreign Policy and National Security Implications of Global Climate Change. It is the spoken testimony, the oral testimony is limited to 5 minutes. I think you all have both submitted written testimony, which is longer or maybe longer. It is the practice of the subcommittee to take testimony under oath. We are an investigations committee. This is not truly an investigation. Since we're asking you to speculate about the future, it's pretty hard to imagine you'll be prosecuted later for perjury. If your forecasts prove to be incorrect. But do either of you have any objection to being sworn in? We do prefer that you tell us the truth, however, even if perjury prosecutions appear unlikely. And you have the right to be represented by counsel. Do either of you have counsel with you today? All right. These are men who are confident of of what they will say. If you would now please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? Thank you. General Sullivan, you may begin.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm here as the chairman of the Military Advisory Board to the CNA Corporation. The advisory board consists of retired 3- and 4-star flag officers from the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. We were charged with looking at the emerging phenomenon known as global climate change through the prism of our own experience, and specifically looking at the national security implications of global climate change. Having said this, I must admit I came to the advisory board as a skeptic. There's lots, and I'm not sure some of the others didn't as well. There's lots of conflicting information on the subject of climate change, and like most public policy issues in America, many opinions on the specific issue. After we listened to leaders of the scientific, business, and governmental communities, both I and my colleagues came to agree that global climate change is and will be a significant threat to our national security. The potential destabilizing impacts of global climate change include reduced access to fresh water, impaired food production, health issues, especially from vector and foodborne diseases, and land loss, flooding, and so forth, and the displacement of major populations. And overall, we view these phenomenon as related to failed states, growth of terrorism, mass migrations, and greater regional and interregional instability. The findings of the board are, first, projected climate change poses a serious threat to America's national security. Potential threats to the nation's security require careful study and prudent planning. Read the NIE. Second, climate change acts as a threat multiplier for instability in some of the most volatile regions of the world. Projected climate change will add to tensions even in stable regions of the world. Fourth, climate change, national security, and energy dependence are a related set of global challenges. The recommendations to the board are that we cannot wait for certainty. In this issue, as has been pointed out here in the two statements this morning, there is a lack of certainty, but there is certainly no lack of challenges. And in our view, failing to act because a warning isn't precise would be imprudent. Second, the United States should commit to a stronger national and international role to help stabilize climate changes at levels which will avoid significant disruption to global stability and security, and we should commit to global partnerships to work in that regard. And I believe there have been a number of activities this week which support that finding. Fourth, the Department of Defense, which it's doing, should enhance its operational capabilities by accelerating the adoption of improved business processes and innovative technologies. And fifth, DoD should conduct an assessment of the impact on military installations worldwide of the rise of sea level, extreme weather events, and other possible climate change impacts over the next 30 to 40 years. Climate change, national security, and energy dependence are all interrelated. Simply hoping that these relationships will remain static is simply not acceptable given our training and experience as military leaders. I think hoping that everything's going to be great probably won't work, at least in our view. In closing, I would say that most of us on the advisory board were in this military service of the United States of America for over 30 years, most of it during the Cold War. Very high levels of catastrophe could have taken place and might have taken place if we didn't invest in military preparedness and awareness of the threats we faced. In our view, there is uncertainty here, and it would be prudent for us to pay attention and to do our best to understand what is really going on so that we could respond if asked. Mr. Chairman, I request my full statement be added to the report, and I stand ready to answer your questions.
Thank you, General. It will, of course, be added. Mr. Woolsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to be asked to appear before you today and to appear beside friend General Sullivan. I want to stress I'm speaking only for myself and not for any institution that I'm associated with. I've attached a 24-page draft of the chapter that you referred to when you introduced me, and I would like to use these 5 minutes to point out several things in that chapter. I deal there with two types of risks to our future. I call them malignant and malevolent disruptions. By malignant, I mean something that, like cancer in the human body, is not intentionally caused, but is the results from our behavior to some extent. And this could either be overloading our electricity grid and having it fail because of storms and tree branches falling in Ohio, as it did 4 years ago,
or putting too much carbon into the atmosphere, and some decades from now perhaps contributing to sinking Bangladesh beneath the waves. We're not trying to take down Canada's electricity, and we're not trying to sink Bangladesh beneath the waves, but sometimes our behavior can cause cascading failures in complex systems. We also, however, face a second set of problems, and I call malevolent, because terrorists are a lot smarter than tree branches. And the vulnerabilities of our energy systems to intentional malevolent interference from terrorism are set forth and described rather fully in the first pages of the report. I think with respect to climate change, it's important to realize that the most disastrous potential effects are, I think, ocean sea level height changes, and those may come about at unexpected times and in unexpected ways, because we have entered a period in which there is exponential change as a result of warming to a degree that we have not, even if we have not accurately forecast precisely when that's going to occur. I think certainty is very difficult in this field, but what should not be difficult is realizing that for both potential malignant changes, such as climate change, and malevolent changes, such as terrorism, the cause may operate and act in ways that we cannot fully understand at this point. What I want to stress is, and I set it up in a perhaps curious way as a dialogue between what I call a tree hugger and a hawk. My tree hugger is the ghost of John Muir, and my hawk is the ghost of George S. Patton. Muir in the chapter is concerned exclusively with carbon. Patton is concerned exclusively with terrorism. The point is that although they don't convince one another of the importance of their concern, what they end up finding they need to do in order to deal with both sets of problems rather remarkably overlaps. Both in the chapter come to the conclusion that radical improvement in efficiency of buildings, particularly steps that have positive paybacks, not costing anything but having internal rates of return of 10% or more, radically increasing the use of combined heat and power, or cogeneration, as Denmark does, and substantially changing the incentives for long-term movement toward distributed generation of electricity and heating and cooling, together with following California's lead in decoupling revenues from earnings for electric utilities so that a utility may make money by improving its efficiency and investing, even if that doesn't produce more electricity. That has led California in the last 20 years to be absolutely level in its degree of energy use per capita, electricity use per capita, whereas the rest of the country's gone up 60%. Some of these changes, including, and I'm run out of time, moving toward also plug-in hybrid gasoline electric vehicles, flexible fuel vehicles, biofuels, more use of electricity for automobile propulsion as well, are all steps that Patton and Muir find they can agree on, even though they are solving different problems. And I would urge on really all participants in this debate, Mr. Chairman, that even though I think both of these problems are serious, I consider myself in this context both a tree hugger and a hawk, I don't think there should be any problem, and nearly as much problem, in cooperating and working together on solutions as there may be on convincing one another of the substantive concern that each of several different groups may have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Woolsey. It is difficult to wear both Birkenstocks and combat boots at the same time.
Well, it's 1 foot each, maybe.
In your the draft of your report that you did provide us, you began with a quote from a British intelligence officer who retired in 1950 after 47 years of service, and said, "Year after year, the warriors and the fretters came to me with awful predictions of the outbreak of war. I denied it each time. I was only wrong twice." How dire, how probable do the consequences that we have? Neither of you are scientists. Neither of you really can predict. We haven't called you for that reason. But how probable do the dire consequences need to be for us to feel some urgency in planning for them as possibilities? General Sullivan?
Well, my response to that is that first of all, I believe there is some planning going on. And it's interesting that this morning when I arrived at the office, I had the statement of General George Casey, Jr., Chief of Staff of the Army, which was made yesterday in a hearing. General Casey said the following: population growth and its youth bulge will increase opportunities for instability, radicalism, and extremism. Resource demand for energy, water, and food for growing populations will increase competition and conflict. Climate change and natural disasters will cause humanitarian crises, population migrations, and epidemic diseases. That was in his hearing yesterday before the Senate. I think the leadership in the Pentagon and around the globe in their official positions are well aware of the nature of this phenomenon and are responding appropriately. I have every reason to believe they are. AFRICOM, the new Africa Command, which is being stood up, I feel quite sure will be paying a lot of attention to some of the issues which are raised.
Woolsey, do you have any sense of what kind of planning should be taking place and how probable the different scenarios need to be for us to be well deep into planning for them?
If one looks at probabilities as the models of the IPCC do, one comes up with sea level rise, and I tend to use that as a proxy for a number of climate effects. Sea level rise of something between 6 or 8 inches and 2 feet during the 21st century. That could be substantial for some parts of the world, such as Bangladesh, and it could be accompanied by a number of very difficult climate circumstances, such as glacial melting, which would make parts of South America very difficult to live in from the point of view of water and the like. It could be quite serious. But the really serious problem is if we hit, and it's hard to attach a probability to this, if we hit one of these tipping points which causes something like a rapid melting of the West Antarctic ice shelf. If I could, this analogy in history, between 14 and 15,000 years ago, sea level was rising at 4 or 5 times today's rate. And then it went from rapid to amok and increased another factor of 4 or 5 and went up by about 20 meters in 400 years, so about 5 meters a century. 5 meters a century is absolutely huge. A lot of climatologists believe that was because the West Antarctic ice shelf may have melted. It could have been something else. But what we have to worry about is not something that human beings can predict very well with their models which operate in a linear fashion. The key point is, when do you hit these tipping points, the knee of the curve, the exponential change in which, from our point of view, everything begins to accelerate. From the point of view of nature, it has probably been operating exponentially all the time, going up by factors of 1 to 2 to 4 to 16, et cetera. So it's a long-winded way of saying I have a hard time attaching a probability to it, and I think the climatologists do too. It's the judgment of people like Dr. Hansen and others about these historical analogies, and when things have changed rapidly in the past and why, that I think we really have to rely on to say it is prudent to begin to do some things, and some important things now. But a lot of what we need to do serves other purposes, such as making us more resilient against terrorism, and a good deal of it actually makes money rather than costing money. So I come out that we should begin to move now, even if we don't have a really good sense of the probabilities.
And my time has now expired. Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I guess I want to go from big philosophical things to little practical things. I think we all know that America's standing in many parts of the world is not what we'd like to have it be. I look back at when the earthquake and tsunami hit in Southeast Asia. The fact that we had military assets available ended up being a lifesaver in Indonesia, again, one of the countries where our approval rating is in the tank. But even people who might have been Islamic fundamentalists who hate the values that we stand for recognize that we saved a lot of lives, and we also saved a lot of suffering of people whose lives were not in jeopardy. How do each of you think that we ought to be looking at an intelligence estimate in terms of not necessarily dealing toward a catastrophic event which may or may not have been caused by climate, but essentially building up goodwill that we are on their side in things like providing agricultural self-sufficiency, which we have done very well since the end of the Second World War, encouraging reforestation, which everybody agrees helps sop up carbon, and reversing the denuding of the rainforests in certain parts of Africa and South America and other parts of the world. How does intelligence and strategic planning fit into that?
I think very closely. If you look at East Africa, there is migration from north to south, out of Somalia into Kenya and nations south. Problem is, not the problem. They're seeking food. They're seeking, in some cases, fish. World Wildlife Federation has a program to assist countries in East Africa create coast guards. Interestingly enough, with relatively small boats, people in those countries are able to go out to patrol their own shores, which in fact limits overfishing. I think there are many things, as you point out, which can be done, and I think commands like AFRICOM under General Kip Ward and his people, they're looking at those issues, deforestation and economic self-sufficiency, agricultural self-sufficiency, and there have been pretty good examples of how reforestating, there is such a word, reforesting or whatever the word is, helps. And I think those are simple things which can be done and will be done. I feel reasonably sure they will be done.
How do you put an American face on that, though?
How do you put it?
How do you put an American face on that?
Well, I think, I don't know this for sure, but I think the Special Forces and some of the military missions which are going on in parts of our Africa do have an American face.
Congressman, I think that in the, even short of any of these sort of catastrophic changes that I referred to earlier, even modest amounts of climate change, particularly warming in the southern hemisphere, let's say here, is likely to have enough weather change associated with it and crop yield changes and fresh water changes that you may start to see rather substantial beginnings of migrations. And a lot of refugees and so forth, particularly from places which are very low-lying, deltas, Bangladesh, etc. I think that until one gets into rather large levels of sea level rise, the worldwide potential deployment and assistance that U.S. Military forces can provide can be a benefit, very substantial benefit in foreign countries, such as they were in Indonesia, as you said, after the tsunami. But they can also be good ambassadors for the country. And I think that some of relatively easy things to do could pay big dividends. For example, we have some amphibious ships, as I understand it, that are about to get scrapped, and it might not be too expensive. I know some groups are talking about doing this, to turn one or more of them into hospital ships for purpose of rapid deployment for our own country in case we have to deal with another tsunami of our own, such as the hurricane damage in New Orleans, but also for places like Indonesia and the rest. One can do a great deal by showing up with even a relatively small contingent of the U.S. Navy and a hospital ship. So.
Thank you.
Can I come back as
Yes.
a follow-up?
General Sullivan, go ahead.
Mr. Sensenbrenner, I've just been told, and Colonel retired Ken Butts will be on the next panel next week. I don't want to steal his thunder. I'll let him explain it, but he is hosting a conference up at Carlisle Barracks with AFRICOM and the Army people working on the type of issues you just raised, and I'd let him explain it to you.
Thank you, General Sullivan. Mr. Baird.
Just a couple of questions. Thank you, first of all, for your service and for being here today. We tend to focus on climate change as maybe the headline impact of CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere, but it also has, CO2 accumulation also has another effect, which in some ways may be at least as dramatic, and that has to do with increasing the acidification of the oceans. And at least some research studies are suggesting rather strongly that as acidification goes up, coral reefs go down. In fact, my understanding is in geological history, the last time that we estimate that CO2 levels were this high and acidification was this high, there are no fossil records of coral reefs for that period. Because basically, and this is not, you don't have to look at climate trends. You can replicate this in a lab. You can make an enclosed space, pump some CO2 into the air, it gets dissolved into the water, that changes the acidity. That acidity takes up the calcium carbonate, and there you go. You've got no coral reefs. And I don't know if that's been looked at, and it's not clear to me how the national security implications, except for some countries, it is their nation, the lack of coral reefs. So, any comments on that would be more than welcome on that issue. And also it has an effect on sea life, et cetera.
Look, I'm not, as has been pointed out, and out truth in lending, I am not a scientist. I'm a history major. I was a soldier for the bulk of my adult life, so let the record show that. But number two, I have visited Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and actually I've visited a couple of times, and I do know that scientists there are very clear on the subject which you raised. That is, acidization of the oceans is having a detrimental effect on plankton, on the growth of krill, so forth and so on, and coral reefs are in fact diminishing, which is reducing sea life, which is reducing food for populations which frankly get their protein, much of their protein from the ocean. And there is a direct link, in my view, connecting the dots, not as a scientist, but as a soldier. There is a direct link between those phenomenon and unrest. And that unrest causes the rest of the chain to be activated. That is, extremists, opportunists who are selling food for exorbitant amounts of money and so forth and so on. Terrorism.
Congressman, I'd agree with General Sullivan, but I would jump perhaps too quickly to what do we do about it? And if we look at the fact that today the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere are approaching double what they have historically been when the world's climate has been more or less like this. Two major recent studies by recent institutions cited on page 17 of my chapter indicate that if you just take the world's buildings and just look at projects to reduce their use of energy that have a 10% or greater internal rate of return. So all of these make money. They don't cost anything. Up front they cost something, but they all have at least a 10% or greater internal rate of return. Just from the buildings in the world, one could hold global warming, or let's say CO2 concentrations, to somewhere between 450 and 550 parts per million. That would be a stunning achievement compared with all of what else is being discussed with respect to CO2 concentrations. That's the first thing that my mythical John Muir and mythical George Patton agree on doing, and it's money-making. So I think if one is even to a modest degree concerned about CO2 concentrations in the ocean, I think for the reasons General Sullivan said, we ought to be more than modestly concerned. Why not go ahead and make the money and make these changes anyway, before we have to decide whether it's disastrous or just difficult?
I appreciate it. Let me raise one other issue. My time will probably expire, but if you look at the situation we have in Iraq right now, with infrastructure, particularly energy being a critical factor, transporting petroleum products or energy over either long pipelines or long transmission lines creates a system that is vulnerable to even the most rudimentary insurgent group with RPGs. You can blow up a pipeline, you can knock down a transmission line with a hacksaw. Amory Lovins, who I'm sure you gentlemen probably know, has done some very important work on national security implications of dispersed energy versus local energy, soft energy paths. My understanding is he's gotten scant attention. He's tried to get attention from our planners in Iraq, but I would certainly think we ought to spend a whole lot more time listening to Amory Lovins and implementing some of his recommendations in Iraq, rather than trying to secure these pipelines at the lives of our boys over there.
Congressman Amory is an old friend of mine. I wrote the foreword to his book, Brittle Power, 25 years ago. He was on my panel for the Defense Science Board. I chaired the policy panel of their recent study of energy issues in defense that's about to come out. And I think you're exactly right. The real fuel cost at the front lines is many hundreds of dollars per barrel of fuel if you allocate all of the logistical train that is needed to get the fuel forward. And energy savings capabilities for our deployed forces are a very important part of their being able to fight effectively, as well as all of the other issues that we're discussing.
Data points: 70% of the weight the Army carries in battles is liquid. It's either fuel or water. It's a huge number, and they're working very hard. I can assure you, the scientists and the research and development people, are working very, very diligently to reduce energy usage, to move, this add the numbers, but it's big, and we've got to get it down.
Hold on, I think your written testimony also makes a point that gasoline convoys are especially difficult to protect. I believe it was yours, and maybe it was General Woolsey.
Yeah,
right. Mr. Woolsey's. Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you. I can tell from your testimony, of course, that you both believe that the there's climate change taking place, and I think most people will agree that there is a climate change taking place. Are you both convinced that the climate change that's taking place is man-made as compared to the many other climate changes that we've gone through? Woolsey already has made reference to in his testimony.
I'm not certain it all is. I think it's a substantial share of it is the scientists call it anthropogenic. That's certainly the conclusion of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But I don't think it matters.
Good.
In a way.
Okay, I'm going to follow up on that. But General, do you believe that the climate change that we're going through, as compared to all these other times that there's been a climate change that has occurred in this Earth, is now caused by human activity?
No.
That's very important, because in the decisions that we're making here, we are being told we have to do certain things and restrict human activity in a way to stop the climate change, which both of you now seem to indicate there is a natural occurrence. Now, those of us who are skeptical about the climate change theory are not skeptical that there are major climate changes that happen in the Earth, and as Mr. Woolsey has repeatedly pointed out in his testimony, we should be prepared for that. And also, let me note that those of us who are skeptics of the global warming theories that were being presented would agree totally with you, Mr. Woolsey, when you suggest that we should be making our engines more efficient for energy independence, also for health reasons, and because we are concerned about clean air and the health of our people, and also there are long-term economic benefits to having more efficient engines. But there is a difference about where you put your emphasis if you buy into what is being told us today, that the climate cycle that we're in is caused by human activity, by humans producing more CO2. And then it's a whole different thing. I certainly buy into, I think there's nothing we're going to do that's going to prevent a cycle of climate that, by the way, is going on Mars and Jupiter at the same time.
Well,
yes, sir. Go right ahead.
I don't agree with that.
Okay.
I don't agree with that.
Well, you
I think
there's some things that we can actually do.
there are some things we can do to mitigate.
No, not mitigate. Reverse. No, mitigate.
Well, I don't know even
Woolsey.
reverse. We reversed ozone.
Well,
We reversed the ozone hole by limiting hairspray and other the use of Freon in our cars.
that's another issue that I will have to say deserves some debate. But in terms of actually reversing the climate change that we're going through today by changing human activity is a lot different than saying, which was Mr. Woolsey saying, we need to do things to plot a strategy so that does not, this climate change that's coming about, like the many other cycles that we've gone through on this Earth, we need to be prepared for it, because there will be national security implications.
Congressman, whether, even if some portion of the climate, let's say the CO2 concentrations are from non-anthropogenic causes, if the pace is the pace that we are seeing now, and we do a number of things that make sense anyway for counterterrorism purposes, for saving money purposes, etc., we may be able to have an effect, whether or not the changes are all anthropogenic, or, as I believe, probably substantially all anthropogenic, or only a little bit anthropogenic.
That's correct. However, there is a great debate, and obviously there are who may not be aware that there are a large number of scientists who suggest that as the Earth changes and has gone through this cycle, that's what is producing more CO2. It's not the fact that human beings are producing more CO2 that's creating the climate change. And thus, what we should be doing is many of the suggestions you've made, which are absolutely on target, and I might add, this is my continual conversation with Governor Schwarzenegger in California, is that there are areas, a large number of areas, where those of us who are skeptical that the human beings are causing global warming, that we should be doing the right thing and making things more efficient and cleaner for that reason. But to try to do this in the name of stopping this climate change, Mr. Woolsey, I think you're more on target, that we should be aiming our efforts, realizing that the climate is changing, as it has so many times in the past, and prepare for it in case there are national security implications.
We can do smart things for patent reasons, or for Muir reasons, or for patent and Muir reasons. And I'm perfectly happy for scientists who don't go along with the climate change theory to recommend taking these steps for patent reasons.
Thank you very
And
much.
I think, speaking for myself and I believe the rest of this committee, we make it very clear that we're not scientists. We're not physicists, although some of them happen to be scientists. One happens to be an astronaut and the other isn't intimately involved with the nuclear industry, nuclear power. But as a group, we were not into all of the data because the data can be contradictory and we're not qualified. What we tried to do is look at the trends, and the fact that you can sail a boat from the Atlantic Ocean to the Bering Sea, and they actually have people sailing 35-foot boats, tells us something. Something is going on, and I have no idea.
General, what it tells us is that just as the Vikings were able to do that very same thing, the Earth is going back to a warmer time period, just as it was during the Viking time period.
Agreed. I don't have any problem with that, but the fact of the matter is it's worth paying attention to.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Walker's time has expired. We've been joined by Dr. Ehlers, not a member of the subcommittee, but someone for whom this is a subject near and dear to his heart, and in the interest of having more material for late-night special orders, Dr. Ehlers, do you have questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you recognizing me. I just simply came here to learn something, and I have learned something. I can't help but respond to my colleague about the many thousands of scientists he said support his point of view. I would say there are many, many, many more scientists who disagree with that. So it's a preponderance of scientific evidence and scientific belief is on the other side. I normally don't bother arguing this point, but I just wanted to make that particular point. As I say, I came here primarily to learn, but in terms of the response we make, I was intrigued by Mr. Sensenbrenner's comment relating to Indonesia. And it occurred to me that perhaps the response, the military response, since that's what this hearing is about, the military response might more appropriately be to send larger contingents of the Army Corps of Engineers than to send combat troops abroad. If, in fact, the problem is the flooding of Bangladesh, which is a major concern, maybe the Army Corps can do much more than combat troops could. I don't want to get into all the pluses and minuses of it, but I appreciate the comments that both of you have made, and I appreciate the understanding you displayed. This is a serious problem, and it does have very strong national security factors related to it, as does our continued overuse of energy from various other parts of the world. I think is one of our greatest national security problems. Not just so much the consumption of it, but the fact that we have developed such a dependence on it that we've become very vulnerable to military actions which reduce the amount of energy available from other countries. So I appreciate the insight that both of you have brought. I have no specific questions, just wanted to make those comments, and thank you for being here. Back.
Thank you, Dr. Ehlers. I now recognize myself for a second round of questioning. There have been questions about the extent to which the changes in the climate, the warming of the globe, are natural, cyclical, and to the extent to which they are caused by human activity. And I'm not sure either of you got to answer your questions entirely, and again, neither one of you are scientists. You're dealing with information from scientists on that. But is it your understanding or belief that human activity can affect the extent to which the planet may warm and therefore what consequences may result. Mr. Woolsey?
Mr. Chairman, you have not one but two history majors in front of you today, so I would very much stress that. But I would, I think, basically go with what I understand is a preponderance of scientific views here, as reflected in the IPCC report, that at least a very substantial share, possibly all, but perhaps slightly less than all, of the concentrations of CO2 that we see today are anthropogenic. They tend to have taken off around the beginning of the industrial era, a couple of centuries ago. They are approaching double what they have been for extended periods of time, although Congressman Rohrbacher's right. Of course, there have been many periods in the history of the world in which climate has changed a lot. But the correlation seems substantial to I think about 90% of the scientists that have looked at this, and I can't do any better than to say it. I would go along with that. But there is, I think, some uncertainty. There are some distinguished people who've not signed on to it.
General Sullivan, your testimony is that military planning or national security planning generally doesn't just take into account what is certain to happen. You plan, given a certain amount of some uncertainty, what might happen, how likely it is, and how to be prepared for those different events. Is it also part of military planning or national security planning to see how the likelihood of different events may be changed by what we do?
Mr. Chairman, you're right on both counts. We normally look at any number of threats and the likelihood of something happening and try to figure out how we could stop it from happening or do something that might stop it from happening if it's in our area of responsibility. And I think that's what's going on in this case. In all cases, though, it's not within the military's purview or the Department of Defense purview to be the only action agent. Right. Other agencies of the government are involved, and we recognize that. So you're right on both counts, and that's really what the basis of our study is. Look, the trends are not good, and what can we do in our planning and our analyses? And I think what's going on at Carlisle next week up at the Army War College is a pretty good indicator of how people are starting to think about it.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just add one point. When I was Director of Central Intelligence, the head of the National Intelligence Council for me was Joseph Nye of the Kennedy School at Harvard. And Joe and I came up with an effort to try to put probabilities on things that really depend on human judgment, what an enemy may, or a potential enemy may do, that it's very, very hard actually to put odds on. We would try to use vague formulations of gambler's odds, 1 chance in 10, something like that, in order to give a feel for probabilities. But the reality is that in dealing with a conscious enemy, a malevolent enemy, it depends on whether he's shrewd or not. If you're fighting Stonewall Jackson, you're probably going to lose unless you have an equally, and there are very few, brilliant general on your side. And if you're trying to deal with something like climate change here, it depends on, in a sense, at what point, and we don't know, the methane begins to be released from the tundra, and since it's 20 times worse than carbon dioxide as a global warming gas, it begins to speed up the warming and the release and speed it up further and further and further. Where is that tipping point? Nobody really knows. So it's very tough if you're dealing with really serious matters like a conscious enemy or something like these tipping points to put probabilities on it. We try, but it's really something that is probably doomed to failure. Qualitative judgments is about the best you can do, I think.
Thank you. Mr. Sensenbrenner is not here, so we'll return to Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you very much. I take it that when you were doing your studies that you did not have any in-depth discussions with any of the major scientists who oppose this concept of man-made global warming. Is that correct?
No, in our case, we did.
Okay. Which scientists?
Kingdom, am I on or off?
So you did. Did you have a name of one or two of the scientists who you talked to? Who was?
Dr. Hansen was the first one. Can I have some?
Dr. Hansen is a major opponent of the.
Yeah, I mean.
Okay, let me just note I will put in the record at this point the statements by several prominent and respected world-class scientists who not only doubt global warming, but lament the fact that many of their fellow scientists are being lured away from their integrity by grants over the last 10 and 20 years, which have been readily available to those people who support the man-made global warming theory, but not available to those people who are opposed to the man-made global warming theory. And we'll put those quotes into the record from several very renowned, respected scientists. Let me ask both of you in your professional, you both come from a national security background. If it was being proposed by Congress, if there was a motion in Congress that would require the military, in the name of doing our part to stop this global warming, and the military's part, that would insist, for example, on lighter armor on tanks, so that the tanks wouldn't produce as much pollution out the other end, even though that lighter armor put our men in jeopardy, or lighter body armor, because the process in developing the body armor was something that caused more pollution, CO2 going in the air. Would you support that move by Congress?
No.
Congress is the wrong institution to design armored vehicles, I think.
Right. But they prioritize. I agree with that. But if we end up with global warming, we say, okay, that's going to be our greatest worry now, not terrorism, not possible military conflict. So the military has to step in line. You guys would both oppose us. Well, let me ask you this. When they say to us, we have to then make our automobiles less armored, meaning you can't have a heavy car. I have 3 kids at home. I want them safe. I want them in a heavier car. Now, the people who are global warming advocates would like to outlaw me. Now, is it any less reasonable for me to say that I'm going to make the decision as to the weight of my car than it is for you to say that you would oppose the efforts of Congress to oppose the weight of armored vehicles of men going into action?
For several years of my life, I had 3 little boys who were in Boy Scouts and soccer teams and baseball teams, and I drove a Chevy Suburban because I was driving baseball teams around. But what I would say today is that if you want a large SUV and you need one for any reasonable purpose, as long as we have it be a plug-in hybrid that is also a flexible fuel vehicle and is running on 85% ethanol, it will be getting something on the order of 200 miles per gallon of gasoline, and that isn't bad.
Sure.
I
and
think
the market will take care of that because people will want to pay less for their gasoline. But what if someone wanted to mandate it, which is basically, it's going to be mandated whether or not that hybrid technology is already available, and thus Dana or whoever else who has kids cannot make the choice of buying a heavier car.
I think Congress's role and the executive branch's role ought to be to get the incentives right and to do away with barriers to competition, such as having vehicles that can only drive on gasoline and can't also drive on alternative liquid fuels. But when the executive branch or Congress or together has tried to pick a solution, it picked the Synfuels Corporation in the late 70s and early 80s, which went bankrupt in 86 when the oil price went down, and it picked the hydrogen highway in the beginning of this decade, which has not worked out well at all for family cars and the rest. So I don't think the record, frankly, of either Congress or the executive branch in picking a single solution is very good. But in terms of getting the incentives right for all of us and removing barriers, I think that is...
I think the greatest incentive, Mr. Woolsey, probably is a high price of oil, which will make the American people choose more efficiently. I agree, and by the way, thank you, General, and Mr. Woolsey, and Mr. General, I'll give you the last say here, but I do appreciate the fact that it was very clear to you that military is going to do their primary mission, and even though you do obviously hold it important that be involved with global trends, but your job is to make sure those men going into action are safe, and you're not advocating
General Sullivan, do you have an answer to the general?
Yeah, I want to make it very clear that the Department of Defense, certainly the Department of the Army, is trying to make tanks lighter and give the same protection, and make vehicles lighter and give the same protection.
Right.
Research and development efforts are moving in that direction. Now, whether they're going to be able to solve the problem or not remains to be seen. That's out there, and there may be ceramics or something. But the point is, we cannot afford to have 70% of the weight which the Army carries be liquid. And that relates to how we power these pieces of equipment. And we have to get them there to the fight quickly. By the way, our job is to win. Okay? It's to win for the American people. And we will do our best. And I'm speaking for myself. I believe the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines will do their best to do that with these trade-offs.
All right. Mr. Rohrbacher's time has expired. Mr. Baird, in your last round of questioning, I think you established that the Maldives have a good deal more to worry about than we do. Mr. Baird.
Yeah, I think the Maldives do. But I also hope I established that there's a decentralized energy approach, as that advocated by Amory Lovins, is much more likely, I think, to provide a sustainable power source, not only ultimately for our troops, but I was really referring to how you get lights on in Baghdad and air conditioning working. Because but I'll tell you, when I was over there and I met the energy minister of Iraq, the electrical energy minister, his main concern was that the Iraqis face a difficult challenge. If they use oil to produce energy, then they don't have oil to sell on the foreign reserve market, or on the international market, and then thereby bring capital in. When I asked him if they'd talked to Amory Lovins, and I asked the U.S. consultants who were accompanying them, they did not know who Amory Lovins was. So I would encourage you, Admiral, if you have a chance to try to talk to General Lute or any of our lead strategists over there, to give another look at that, because I spoke personally after that visit to Iraq. I called Amory Lovins and spoke to him on the phone, and he said he's tried 3 times to get folks to really pay attention, and basically they don't get the concept. And I hate to think our guys are going to try to defend a couple 100 or 1,000-mile pipeline when we could have some alternatives. I'd welcome any thoughts you have about how you can convince our military. Then the second question, if I may, is if you look at some of the areas where we have conflicts, they're clearly related to oil, and if you look at some of the international impressions of our country, it's that we go to war for oil regardless of human rights sometimes, and certainly I've heard that from constituents back home. And you look at Nigeria and elsewhere in the world where our policies have not necessarily backed progressive regimes. A second question after the Amory Lovins one, if you have time to get to both, would be, how does our dependence on oil cause us to back regimes that may lower our international standing or actually lead ultimately to conflict that we might otherwise avoid?
One of our panel members, this is to the Lovins question, one of our panel members was Admiral Truly, and he and Dr. Lovins have collaborated on a number of issues, and Dr. Lovins, certainly his name and some of his feelings came up during the study group. On a previous study that our executive director, Ms. Goodman behind me, participated, and he was a part of that, so I think his feelings were well known by the group.
The Pentagon's not paying much attention. I tell you, in Iraq, they didn't even know the guy's name. This was the electrical minister for Iraq, so the concepts are alien to them.
Congressman, I think the notion of distributed generation of electricity, it's dealt with on pages 18 and 19 of the text of my chapter that I submitted, is very important for the military, and sometimes it takes a while for things to filter through. But the Defense Science Board report that is about to come out moves us both domestically and, I think, in terms of operations overseas toward fuel conservation in many ways and distributed generation in many ways. I think you'll find it a useful thing. As far as dependence on the wrong regimes, I surely could not agree more. There's a professor at Oxford named Paul Collier who was an economist for the World Bank, I believe, for some years, and he has written extensively about the degree to which oil, or indeed it's true of anything that has a lot of economic rent associated with it, that is, a lot of economic return that's not based on either investment or labor. A lot of economic rent tends to concentrate power in the central government of the country that's producing it. It's not accidental that of the top 12 oil reserve countries in the world, about 10 of them are either dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. As Bernard Lewis puts it, there should be no taxation without representation, but it's also true that there's no representation without taxation. If you don't need taxes, you don't need a legislature. And a number of these countries that are very rich in oil don't have real legislatures. The executive branches of those countries don't have to sit in front of hearings and be asked questions by independent elected representatives of the people. So, in a way, by helping move away from oil, I think, for powering our transportation system almost exclusively by introducing competitive fuels, electricity, ethanol, butanol, whatever. I think one is, over the long run, taking some very positive directions for the governance of some of these other countries and societies. But I think you're exactly right on this.
I'm very grateful for your comments. I wish our administration would call upon the American people to make some of these changes as a patriotic duty in the interest of our national security. I think it would put a much different light on our energy policy, and it's certainly merited. And I'm grateful for your service and insights today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this good hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Brunn?
Mr. Woolsey, in your report, you point to our nation's dependence on foreign oil as a major point of concern, and I certainly agree with that and concur fully. Yet there are significant supplies of domestic oil and natural gas in areas such as the Outer Continental Shelf and in Alaska, not only in ANWR, but in other areas up there. Nuclear power has proven to be one of the cleanest energy sources on Earth, and the last nuclear power plant that we built in this nation, I believe, was in 1973. Now, I know that there are no permanent solutions, but it seems to me that the most expedient solution might be looking for domestic sources of oil as well as other energy sources. Certainly in my area of Georgia, we don't have the amount of wind that they do out west to develop energy through wind technology or other things, some of these other alternative sources of fuel. And I'm, for one, very eager to search for alternative energy sources, not only to power automobiles, but also electricity, and certainly we seem to use a lot of that around here too. So don't you think that maybe searching for domestic sources of energy is maybe a best type of policy that we should have as government?
It's certainly part of what we need to do, Congressman. Nuclear is not going to substitute for oil, imported oil or any other oil, however, because only about 2% of our electricity is produced by oil. Back in the 70s, it was different. 20% or so was produced. So if you built a nuclear power plant in the 70s, you could well be replacing oil consumption. But today, our use of oil for electricity is almost negligible. I think nuclear power has some advantages. Lack of global warming gas emissions is certainly one. And if Congress and the executive branch can agree on the degree of essentially public insurance that is to be provided for nuclear power, it may well take up some of the slack that may be needed for new power plant construction. But I don't think we ought to look at it as a long-term solution globally, because I believe today over 60% of the new nuclear power plants that are being built in developing countries. And because the international treaty regime for proliferation does not really deter countries that have nuclear power plants from getting into the fuel cycle with uranium enrichment or plutonium reprocessing, once you have a nuclear power plant, you are unfortunately likely to be off into the business of producing fissionable material. And so it's not really a problem here, although we have to store our nuclear waste and agree on how to do it. But it is a problem in lots of parts of the world unless we want to see proliferation grow substantially. As far as domestic oil is concerned, I've been generally in favor of offshore drilling. I think that's now ecologically and in engineering terms quite sound. I have opposed drilling in the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge in substantial measure because of the insecurity of the Alaska pipeline, which Amory Levins and I have written together about and call a very large piece of chapstick just about to happen. It is extremely vulnerable, even to rifle fire, much less anything else. I think that what has to take place is that we need to do to oil and its monopoly of transportation, its 97% monopoly of transportation, what electricity and refrigeration did to salt at the end of the 19th century. In the late 19th century, salt was a strategic commodity. It mattered whether your country had salt mines. Countries fought wars over salt mines. It's hard to imagine now. Today, we don't care, because salt's unique role in preserving meat was effectively destroyed by electricity and refrigeration. What we need to do is not destroy oil and not stop using oil, but we need to break oil's monopoly on transportation. And I think that if we do that, things will sort themselves out, given the amount of carbon used, given its accessibility and so forth, in a reasonable way. But I think the first priority, to me, is things like plug-in hybrids and alternative liquid fuels, so that we can break oil's monopoly on transportation. And then I think some domestic oil production, particularly offshore, sure.
Well, I think with the current technology with the hybrids, it depends on how far you drive every day, whether they make sense economically or not. And it looks to me, in the short run, maybe expediting building safe nuclear power plants, as well as looking for domestic sources of petroleum products, and maybe new coal technology, et cetera, make more sense. If we can ever figure out how to create hydrogen, that may be even another source, but that's just my point. And looking domestically makes more sense to me than trying to further things that maybe not economically feasible now. So
thank you.
Would you comment about that?
Well, actually, the gentleman's time has expired.
Excuse me.
That's all right. Dr. Ehlers, do you have any questions? You don't have to if you don't want to. But Dr. Ehlers, your mic apparently is not working. Okay.
Thank you. I have been an advocate of nuclear energy for some time, even though I'm Mr. Muir. Have been a Sierra Club member for many years and have argued with them on this point, simply because the issue is not displacing oil, it's displacing carbon dioxide producing materials, which is largely coal and natural gas in the power plants at this point. And if we are going to impinge, and I agree with you, Mr. Woolsey, that the real problem is transportation. And if we do, in fact, go the route of plug-in hybrids, we're going to need considerable amounts of electricity, and I'd prefer that be produced by nuclear plants rather than coal burning or natural gas burning plants, particularly since natural gas in my opinion, is too good to burn. It's an incredible feedstock for the petrochemical industry, and it's ideal for serving or for providing heat for residences. Burning it in an electric power plant, I think, is not an optimum use.
Congressman, I certainly agree that the electricity needs to be produced cleanly, and nuclear may be one way to do that with the qualifications I mentioned earlier. I would only add that the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory has done a very thorough study of plug-in hybrids, and they say that 85% of the cars on the road could be plug-in hybrids before you need a single new power plant, because you're using off-peak overnight power. And that's one of the reasons why shifting from an internal combustion engine to a plug-in hybrid, even in coal-heavy states where the grid is largely run by coal, still saves something on global warming gas emissions. And in a state like California with a very clean grid, it saves a great deal with respect to global warming gas emissions.
Yes.
Would my colleague yield for a question?
Yes, I'll be happy to yield. I think I'll be happy to yield.
Yes, this is where we agree. I appreciate your comments on nuclear energy, and I would draw your attention and ask, this is in the form of a question, but drawing our attention of the panel as well to the high-temperature gas-cooled reactor that has now been designed, and prototypes have been built by General Atomics in San Diego. Are you aware of the high-temperature gas-cooled reactor?
I'm aware of a number of different reactors, and I think the great lack is we have not done adequate research on the many types of reactors. For example, the hydrogen project, which no one seems to say much about today, depends entirely on being able to produce and transport hydrogen at fairly low cost. Clearly, the traditional ways of doing it are not good. Well, perhaps high-temperature reactors.
The reason I bring up that, Mr. Ehlers, is that Mr. Woolsey brought up the problems of nuclear waste and also the proliferation issue. And those two issues do not need to prevent us from moving forward with nuclear energy, and I would suggest that maybe our panel would like to look at this alternative, because it's a nuclear power plant that does not produce waste at the same level, and it will not produce material that can be turned into bombs, and so it takes care of a lot of problems. And I would hope that you, Mr. Ehlers, is someone I deeply respect and pay attention to, as well as our panel, would look at this alternative when looking at the issue we're discussing today. Thank you very much.
I yield back.
Thank you. I accept your time. Mr. Reichert. All right, that was convenient. We have time, I think, for another round of questions, if everyone does respect the time. And then we do have a set of votes. We probably will need to carry over into the first couple of minutes of votes. But if we could have a quick last round of questions for this distinguished panel, and the next panel is also distinguished, and we will hear their testimony after the votes. General Sullivan, in the earlier questions, whether you would favor reducing the armor if it made armored vehicles less sturdy in battle, you said no, but you also said that you thought that the need for lighter vehicles because of fuel needs certainly justified research and developing lighter but still strong materials. Is that correct?
That's correct. I'm not in favor of, look, protection, lethality, and mobility are the three variables which are considered in armored vehicles. And you can see in the MRAP, this new vehicle which the troops will receive, the wheeled vehicle, that's very heavy because that's what you need to protect the troops. Mm-hmm. It's our most precious asset. But that doesn't mean that the scientists and the people in the labs aren't working to reduce the weight of the armor which goes on vehicles. And it may be that it's ceramics or some substance which, I'm sorry the doctor left, plastics and so forth and so on. So you've got a trade-off, and I'm sure they will work their way through that.
the British report that I referred to in my opening remarks estimated that the world's response to carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, would cost perhaps 1% of the world's GDP. In view of the threat, does that expense seem justified by the threat we faced, General Sullivan?
1%. I don't know. I'm not qualified to.
Okay.
And I'm really not qualified to draw that kind of conclusion.
Okay. Mr. Woolsey?
I think it does, yes, in part, however, because taking the steps that one needs to take also make the whole system much more resilient against terrorism. And also, a number of those steps that the Stern, I guess it's the Stern report, in the numbers, I think don't take into account some of the things we were talking about before, some of the ideas that Amory Levins's Rocky Mountain Institute have been instrumental in pushing, of what they call negawatts, that is, of efficiency improvements that make money. I don't think those types of considerations played a major role in the Stern report. These, for example, these building improvements that in my draft Patton and Muir start off with. Yes, I mean, if it takes 1%, because these are both important issues, both terrorism and climate change, in my personal judgment, it's worth it. But I think we ought to make sure that we aren't taking expensive and unnecessary steps rather than profit-making ones in order to get where we want to go.
So you think 1% may have been overstated?
It's possible. I think so. I think if you turn the Stern report over to the Rocky Mountain Institute and ask them to critique it, I'll bet you would find that they would say there are cheaper ways to take the steps that we're taking.
And I think both of you have either explicitly or implicitly already addressed this. Whether the steps are what the Stern report suggested, or there are other cheaper, smarter things to do you think what we have done to this point, or doing now, are aggressive enough in view of the threats we face? General Sullivan.
I'll only speak to what I know. I think that, in General Casey's point yesterday, was indicative of an awareness by the senior leaders, one of the chiefs, member of the Joint Chiefs, senior Army officer, that these issues are important. And I have reason to believe, AFRICOM is another case in point, that the senior military leaders in the country, of our country, are addressing the issue of global climate change. And in the NIE, I think, is another example, and Admiral McConnell, who is doing the NIE, who's responsible for it, has said that it is important, and so I think everybody's getting the word, and it's moving.
Mr. Rohrbacher is recognized for just 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, and I do think it's important for us to note that General said exactly the right thing, and that is his job is making sure that our country's protected and those people can do their job in defending our country. And while no one disagrees with the fact that we should trying to develop better, more efficient technologies, the question is when we have to make decisions right now versus climate change, that we're going to have some effect on climate change, that will in some way prevent the military from doing their job, the general is going to have the military do their job.
Well, I think I think that's exactly what happened with the MRAP and body armor and everything else that's protecting the troops, or giving the troops what they need. We can't wait for 10 or 20 years to make it happen.
And General, the same principle is true. Unfortunately, we're being told by the alarmists here about climate change that we have to have another criteria for how we make our decisions based on, and certainly I agree with Mr. Woolsey, yes, we should have SUVs that can protect our people, our kids, and our families, but we should not necessarily mandate it now if the technology isn't ready and say that SUVs have to be lighter or whatever, if that is not ready right now. And the alarmists would have us put people in jeopardy. And it's as simple as that. And first of all, I want to appreciate both your testimony today, and I respect both of you tremendously. One just question: when you look over this report, examined the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, what did it say that if we implemented all of their recommendations with the tremendous cost to the world that we're talking about, what percentage of the climate, of the increase in the temperature of the planet would we achieve? In other words, what are we going to get out of, if we went along with all the Intergovernmental Panel climate change recommendations and the things that they said we need to do, which are many of them are very draconian, what type of change would we expect to achieve, and did they say they would achieve, in terms of preventing the increase in the temperature of the planet?
Congressman, I tend to use the sea level rise as a proxy, and I realize that's not a perfect way to go at it, but the IPCC's predicted range, I think, for the 21st century is somewhere between around 8 inches and 2 feet.
And how many, if all of the recommendations were followed, with all of the costs associated with that, what would be the change in the ocean?
I don't know. I don't think of the IPCC as being the institution that is likely to be providing the best recommendations for action. I think
I'm not talking about action. If all of their actions done, the IPCC had recommendations for us, with the Kyoto Treaty, etc., through the Kyoto. If all of those recommendations were put in place, let me just note for the record, the actual achievement would be minuscule, just minuscule. And I don't have it with me right here, the exact amount. And but just let us note that you have to. One of the reasons some of us who are skeptical about what's going on not only is the fact that leading scientists have said that their colleagues have been lured away from their integrity by the promise of grants, but that what the general suggested, his reasonable decision-making process was not being used in meeting the other demands on the civilian economy in terms of what we would get out of those decisions, so out of implementing those recommendations.
There are a number of things that the IPCC doesn't touch on that could be far cheaper and far more effective than other points that are being made. I'll just refer you to Pattons and Muir's 9 points in this chapter I wrote. And these are not original with me. They've been picked up from all sorts of different sources, but some of them are rather dramatic. For example, Denmark today gets 50% of its electricity from combined heat and power. It means they just take the waste heat from factories, turn generators, supply power to themselves. It's heat that's wasted today. We are way under 10% of that in the United States simply by being smart.
My time is up, and let me just note, I appreciate your testimony. I agree with everything you've said today, and the bottom line is that we should be more efficient and more save consumption of oil, and et cetera, become more independent for a lot of reasons other than climate change. Thank you.
Mr. Baird.
You recognize me for just 5 minutes, Mr. Chairman.
If you use less, you would be viewed by the chair as a great American.
Thank you. I would like to thank these two great Americans for what I think is one of the, actually we have a tremendous number of hearings in this body, as you know, and I think this hearing is one that all Americans should have a copy of. And I commend you for your insights and the perspective you bring to this. As historians, I would ask you this question. One of my concerns about this conflict we currently face in Iraq and about how we deal with potential for climate change, acidification of the oceans, and all the other impacts is that there seems to be a reluctance on part of our political leaders to truly call on the American people to dig deep in a spirit of patriotism and national and international interest to change their behaviors. Post-World War II, when World War II broke out, the nation was in the fight. When September 11th happened, we were told to go shopping. As historians, what insights can you give us in terms of ways that we might rally the American people to change their behavior in relation to how we use energy and where energy comes from as a national security as well as environmental and other interests?
Well, first of all, I'm a soldier, I'm a retired general officer. I'm somewhat reluctant to get into an area that is not my own. But certainly, as you allude to, I think this is an important conflict we're in, however you may feel about it politically, and I understand there are varying views on that, certainly up here as well as elsewhere throughout America. But we do have young men and women serving in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and they could use more of their fellow citizens, and asking the American people to support the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines with qualified people is, in my view, an important indication of how the Americans feel about their own security. And service to nation in uniform is a noble calling. Now, to your point about sacrificing, if somebody somewhere can draw a link, and I'm not sure I can, but if they could draw a link, as I say, I don't see how I could if I were in the position of trying to mobilize public opinion to this issue that we're discussing here and this conflict. I suppose you could if you went into the discussion that Mr. Woolsey was involved in, and where oil comes from, and the politics of all of that. Okay, reduce the consumption of oil. I think in the long run, that's very important, but I don't think they would, other than as a catalyst for that discussion, I think it would be tough to sell it on what's going on in Iraq and Iraq mainly. It could be done, but other people more expert than me in that, the mobilization of the American people, a la World War II and Ken Burns and all of that, which is apparent to everyone who watches it. I think you have a good point, but...
Congressman, I would say that a clear call for a national commitment to move toward alternative fuels for transportation and distributed generation of energy, both fuels and electricity, with an eye toward renewables. But if you move toward distributed generation, it tends to be renewables. It's hard to put a coal-fired power plant on your roof. And I think the technologies are moving that way. Photovoltaics is taking off in part because of what the progress that was already made with silicon chips for computers, and much of the technology is similar. Genetically modified biocatalysts to make transportation fuel out of waste and so forth is taking off because of genetic modification work done for pharmaceuticals, and battery capabilities are taking off because nobody wants to recharge their cell phones more than once a day. And because unrelated to energy, these three things are all happening, and they give us an opportunity to exploit these technologies and I think have the kind of call for national action that you were suggesting.
Thank you. This panel is now concluded. I think we all need to run to the floor to vote. But thank you very much, both Mr. Woolsey and General Sullivan. We will be in votes for a while, it looks like. There are 5 votes, so we could be gone for 45 minutes. But we will take the testimony of the next panel when we return. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of our panelists for being here today and welcome you. At this time, I would like to introduce our second panel. Dr. Alexander Lennon is a research fellow in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and co-director of the forthcoming CSIS report, The Potential Foreign Policy and National Security Implications of Global Climate Change. Dr. Andrew Price Smith is an assistant professor of political science at Colorado College, director of the Project on Health and Global Affairs, and author of the book, The Health of Nations, Infectious Disease, Environmental Change, and Their Effects on National Security and Development. Dr. Kent Hughes Butts is professor of political military strategy and the director of National Security Issues Group at the U.S. Army's War College Center for Strategic Leadership. Welcome to all of you. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. It is also the practice of the subcommittee to take testimony under oath. Do you have objections to be sworn in? You also have the right to be represented by counsel. Is anyone represented by counsel at today's hearing? Please stand and raise your right hand. You swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? I do, okay. Mr. Lennon, you may begin and you can be seated.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's an honor to be invited here before the subcommittee to share my experiences with you today. Coming from the national security community, I think most members traditionally approach climate change thinking about how Russia might be affected and how our competition with other major powers could come into play. With members from the environmental community, climate change connotes images of glaciers melting, sea levels rising, polar bears losing their homes. My experience with this issue has turned both of these premises on their head. Over the next generation, the foreign policy and national security implications for the United States are strongest because of the weakness that simply things like more frequent storms, more severe storms, and changes in rainfall patterns might be able to cause over a generation. Over the past year, I've learned a tremendous amount from being the co-director of a project at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that has sought to combine the best insight of 2 traditionally separate communities, both the scientists in policy and climate change with analysts of foreign policy and national security. The project intentionally did not delve into questions about whether climate change is occurring, who's responsible for it, or what to do about it. It focused exclusively on how to understand the better potential foreign policy and national security implications if climate change were to occur. The key to our focus was to change the time frame of both communities' and traditional analysis. That time frame was to look at the national security, to bring the national security community to look at a problem over the course of a generation, or about 30 years, or the time it takes for the purchases of major military platforms. Over climate change, what we found is that while the greatest temperature changes will be observed toward the poles, the fragility of societies and the governments that are closest to the equator mean that the national security implications for the United States are greatest in those regions of the world. 4 risks in particular struck me through our work. First is that climate change would exacerbate water, food, and energy shortages and increase the risk of at least political stress, particularly because of water shortages in the Middle East. Second, while many countries face stress from climate change, the geopolitical significance of China and the water shortages, desertification, migration, and public unrest that it may face over the next 30 years could undermine any fragile progress in economic and political modernization in that country or Beijing's ability to act as a responsible stakeholder in the international system. Third, migration within and from both South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly to Europe, threatens to cause instability in the developing world and increase the risk of radicalization in Europe of Muslim communities, which then must deal with politically sensitive migration issues. Finally, and potentially of greatest concern to me, the effects of global climate change such as famine, disease, and storms can strain poor regions of the world, undermine brittle confidence in governments, and increase the risk of state weakness and failure, a contributing cause to terrorism over the course of the next generation. The single greatest lesson from the project that I learned is that well before we get to the stage of rising sea levels or islands disappearing, there are sincere national security consequences to at least consider from simply storms and changing patterns of rainfall. I have a longer testimony that I prepared that I would request would be submitted for the record, but in the interest of time and to keep the statement short and to engage in questions, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions I might be able to.
I think than we've we have Dr. Price-Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I will be discussing the impact of global climate change on infectious disease, its implications for economic and political instability, and for U.S. national security. As you will see from the slides now presented to you, I will be discussing first the precipitation trends. This is IPCC data from, as you can see, 1900 to 2000. In my opinion, it's the best global data set available, period. The effects of precipitation on infectious disease are going to be expressed through precipitation's effects on vectors, namely mosquitoes, flies, snails, and so forth. And specifically, increased precipitation will lead to increasing prevalence of malaria, schistosomiasis, and perhaps other diseases as well. Next slide, please, Larry. These are the annual temperature trends from 1976 to 2000. What we're likely to see here is an expansion of the ranges of disease-bearing vectors in terms of both latitude and altitude, which means that diseases like malaria are expected to move from the tropics towards the poles, so from the tropical to the subtropical and temperate regions. Furthermore, malaria and other vector-borne diseases may expand in terms of altitudinal range. In other words, moving upwards, up hills and mountainsides to affect cities like Nairobi and Kenya, which historically was free of malaria but is no longer so as a result of the warming trend in that region. I must confess I came to this topic as a bit of a skeptic. It was at Kent's invitation to a conference for the TISS down in North Carolina. However, I have changed my views a bit on some of these issues. Another thing that's interesting, if we could go back to the precipitation slide for a second, is that changes in aridity, all right, arid environments, are in fact inimical to certain pathogens such as schistosomiasis, which is borne by snail vectors, specifically Onchomelania. So you will see that in portions of Central Africa, right there, indicated by the orange dots, those increasingly arid environments will actually see a decline in certain pathogens such as malaria and schistosomiasis because of their declining moisture. So what I'd like to state is that climate change generates winners and losers. It's contextual, and it depends upon both the pathogen in question and on the vector. Into the realm of economics. Well, before we get there, actually, let's discuss nonlinearities. As Woolsey indicated, he brought this up this morning, I think it's important to think in terms of nonlinear terms, all right? Diseases don't gradually increase. They expand geometrically once they attain a rate of expansion over 1 within any given population. So thinking that climate change is just going to generate linear, slow, incremental change in terms of disease prevalence may be the wrong way to go. All right, we may see exceptional explosions of diseases in certain areas and also rapid declines of disease in other regions. Again, it's contextual. In the realm of economics now, health is a central driver of economic productivity. It's been rather established, I think. Conversely, disease erodes productivity, savings, and aggregate wealth in affected societies. Jeffrey Sachs has estimated that malaria alone generates a 1.3% drag on GDP per capita growth in affected nations. Furthermore, disease exhibits differential impacts on class. The burden of disease falls primarily on the poor and middle class and historically has exacerbated inequities between classes. Politically, I think that, just in conclusion here, and I'd be happy to answer more questions, pathogens should be thought of as stressors upon the state and upon societies and upon economies. It can exacerbate pre-existing conflicts between classes, ethnicities, religious factions, and between state and society. The destabilization is likely pathogen-specific, and areas at risk, in my opinion, include South Asia, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and portions of Latin America. The effects on U.S. national security, in my opinion, will be primarily indirect. But disease can act as a stressor to 1, weaken states, 2, radicalize populations, and 3, may thus facilitate radical and or terrorist activities, in my opinion. So in some, much more research is actually required in this domain. It's a very new domain of exploration, climate to disease to economic and political outcomes, and hopefully we can provide more information to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, another interesting perspective, and I'm glad that you told me about snails because I understood mosquitoes and flies, but I thought, what do snails have to do with this? So thank you. Next we have Dr. Butts. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for allowing me to contribute to the work of the Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight. The relationship between climate change and security is important and will play a major role in defining the future vitality of the United States. Today I will focus on the role of the Department of Defense in addressing climate change and security issues, and in particular highlight the value of involving the regional combatant commands in building sovereign nation capacity for mitigating and destabilizing climate change threats. Before I begin, please allow me to note that I am appearing today on my own behalf, and my views do not represent the views of the U.S. Army War College or the United States Army or the Department of Defense or any other establishments with which associated. While debate continues on the causes of climate change, significant consensus for addressing its security dimensions already exists, and it creates many opportunities for alliance and partner cooperation building on issues of major significance to regional security. The security community is still coming to grips with soft security issues in general and climate change in particular. For years, security studies focused on force-on-force issues and reflected the Cold War milieu. New definitions take time to build constituencies. Terms such as environmental security, economic security, human security have different stakeholders and require different approaches from the security community. Climate change is an environmental security issue and should be considered in that context. Environmental security refers to a, quote, process whereby solutions to environmental problems contribute to national security objectives. While the relationship of environmental issues to security was recognized previously, the end of the Cold War brought a new examination of the dimensions of security and the recognition that environmental issues could inflame existing tensions into conflict, but could also serve as confidence-building measures to reduce tensions. NATO's post-Cold War strategic concept made this clear. Risks to security are less likely to result from calculated aggression, but rather from the adverse consequences of instabilities faced by many countries. Security and stability have political, economic, social, and environmental elements as well as the indispensable defense dimension. Climate change affects the management of these elements and is a threat multiplier for instability in most of the volatile nations of the world. In the post-Cold War era, then, instability is the chief threat to U.S. national security interests. Soft security issues left untended have the potential to destabilize regions and become hard security issues which require the introduction of combat forces and threaten U.S. security interests. The security dimensions of climate change could be characterized as having three levels: global, geopolitical, and regional. If you looked at the 2006 Quadrennial Defense Review at the Department of Defense, it states that the transformed DoD seeks to take preventive actions so problems do not become crises. This should be the U.S. approach to climate change and security and involve all elements of national power. Department of Defense, as the military element of national power, should support that effort. DoD can contribute to security dimensions at each level. DoD can reduce its energy consumption and carbon emissions. It can encourage technological research, development in energy conservation, clean fuels, and alternative energy. It can prepare for military responses to new geopolitical realities such as competition for Arctic resources. It can proactively build regional capabilities and alliances to create climate change resilience and preserve regional stability. These missions make sense and will result in major source savings for energy, waste disposal, and combat arms deployments. However, DoD should not assume the climate change responsibilities of other agencies. These agencies should be properly resourced and directed to assume their climate change missions. While the ongoing National Intelligence Estimate and Military Advisory Board summaries of the threat to security are pressing, we need to do more. The question should be asked, where is DoD possibly involved in solving environmental security issues? Where are U.S. national security threats evident? What resources should be brought to bear? And how should the Department of Defense be working with other agencies to do that? If we put those questions in our national security strategy, if we suggest answers to those questions and delineate which agencies will be involved, then DoD strategic documents will address climate change, and we will have the best minds that are addressing security nationwide addressing the security dimension, and we will preserve the vitality of the United States. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. I do have some questions. Again, very interesting testimony. Would like to talk to you further about the work that you're doing. First First of all, this is a question to all three of you. Are the multinational structures for cooperation that we have in place adequate to meet the scope of the challenges? Are we facing a moment in the not-too-distant future when new institutions will be needed? Has the time come when we should be thinking about designing and creating them? And you can go in any order you want. Anyone that wants to answer first. Don't be bashful.
Madam
Yes, Dr.
Chairman,
Butts, yeah.
I think we have the institutions in place that we need to work the problem. It's a matter of assigning it priority and resources. That's not to say that for all security issues we shouldn't have a re-architecturing of our security apparatus. But in terms of dealing with this issue, from my perspective, I think we can go a long way towards solving many of these problems and promoting resilience and dealing with the stability aspects of this by creatively using the resources, institutional resources that we have in place.
I'll go next if that's fine, Alex. I would say in the realm of global public health, no. I don't think that global institutional structures and institutions are adequate to deal with the issue at this point in time. And the analogy would be looking at the global HIV/AIDS epidemic, which has ravaged much of the developing world over the last few years. It continues to expand. In recent work I've done on the HIV/AIDS epidemic, UNAIDS has painted a very rosy picture for you, but in fact, when you take the data and crunch it and look at it, the epidemic continues to expand in South Asia, in East Asia, certainly in Russia and the former Soviet republics, and other regions of the planet as well. So even though there's been some decline in HIV, it's not uniform. In fact, it continues to expand. Malaria is not under control whatsoever. Dengue fever is restricted right now by temperature gradients and vectors, but it may expand. And I'm very concerned about the lack of funding for the WHO, the World Health Organization. I'm very concerned about the lack of human capital within that organization. I think that organization has suffered historically from some rather poor leadership in recent years. I know I'm not going to be invited to their parties anymore for saying this, but I have my concerns. So I think that the United States in particular needs to truly reassess the WHO and try to augment its capacity to deal with some of the changes that I foresee.
If you were king for a day, I just want to follow up on your answer. How would you organize it? What do you think we need to do?
Wow. I would, thank you, Madam Chairman. I would look at the politicization of that organization over the years, and I would try to address some of the things that have gone on there in terms of demoting key personnel for what I see as political reasons. I will give you one example. Dr. David Heyman was in charge of the polio eradication initiative for many, many years. He achieved spectacular successes, and yet, because of his successes, he was, I won't say demoted, but removed from that position. And of course, polio has exploded out of sub-Saharan Africa back into South Asia, I believe largely as a result of that. So I think that a study should be undertaken to look at that type of reorganization. And if the Congress was going to task us with something, we would be pleased to undertake that.
Thank you. Dr. Lennon?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I come at this more from a geopolitical angle, and one of the things that has struck me in my brief analysis of climate change is how incredibly quickly this issue has jumped up on the international scene. And I think about your question in two ways, is institutions to address the causes of climate change and institutions to address the consequences of climate change. I think for most analysts, you hear the words mitigation and adaptation come up, and there's an increasing sense that some of both is going to be needed to address the challenge as it emerges and as it becomes clearer what we're dealing with over time. On the front end of dealing with the consequences of, or the causes of climate change, I think you're only beginning to see existing international institutions deal with the issue. You had it at the US-EU summit in April, at the G8 summit in June, at the APEC meeting in September. You now have a new major emitters conference today and tomorrow. All of these proliferation within existing institutions, I think, is probably the right way to manage the issue, as well as supplement it with new bilateral conversations. To my knowledge, there is no bilateral conversation with China, for example, that focuses exclusively on climate change as an issue. It's dealt with as a subset of the senior economic dialogue, or as an energy issue exclusively, rather than as the broader consequences that may be involved with climate change. On the consequence side, I think Dr. Butts is better equipped than I am to answer it. You've seen some initial cooperation in things like the response to the Indian Ocean Summit that has to jump up on a regional basis. But the prepositioning of some form of, if not institutional cooperation, at least informal cooperation that can be drawn upon when a crisis emerges could be beneficial to deal with future events like an Indian Ocean tsunami if they occur in the future.
Thank you. Dr. Price-Smith, in your written testimony, you say the balance of available evidence indicates that global climate change will shift the distribution of disease vectors into new regions and thereby afflict previously uninfected populations. Can you state some cases in which this process is already underway or, given the existing trends in global warming, appears likely?
Yes, Madam Chairman. In fact, one of the best examples of this has been the expansion of mosquito-borne malaria into the city of Nairobi in Kenya, which epidemiologists that I'm familiar with attribute directly to the increasing temperatures, nighttime temperatures in particular, of Nairobi, which have allowed the mosquitoes to thrive at that altitude. There is not sufficient information across all types of pathogens, so we need to do greater studies. I can give you other, there's evidence that cholera is responsive to temperature. And cholera it tends to be transported throughout the oceans in the form of algal blooms. So the cholera bacilli actually go into the algae blooms, and then they drift across the ocean currents. What tends to happen is that it's associated with nonlinear progressions of sea surface temperature. But as sea surface temperature increases to a certain threshold point, you'll suddenly see an explosion of algae. And that explosion of algae correlates with an explosion in cholera bacteria. And so again, we may see, not a lot of cholera for some time, and then suddenly you'll hit that threshold point and you may see an explosion of it.
Thank you. Dr. Butts, in your written testimony, the Defense Department has no overarching directive or policy guidance that directs DoD organizations to address the security threats of climate change or act to mitigate its effects. Does this mean that the department has applied no strategic thinking to how it would deal with problems of climate change that climate change may provoke? If so, what steps, in your view, could be taken to remedy this?
This morning, I think we heard General Sullivan address the fact that he thought that many of the leaders at Department of Defense were actively thinking about climate change and had undertaken activities that were related to it. And I would agree. The results of that Defense Science Board study that Mr. Woolsey is on will demonstrate that there's much thinking going on in energy. You can look at the work of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Installations and Environment, Mr. Tad Davis' work on sustainability and the ability there to reduce energy consumption and promote the use of scarce resources in an efficient fashion. But most of these efforts have been driven by economics and national security, reduced dependence on unstable sources of energy supply, reduce our expenditures on energy, reduce the vulnerability of task forces that must carry supplies of fuel to the front. What's missing is an overarching set of guidelines that tell all elements of the Department of Defense to examine the security dimensions of the climate change phenomenon and apply it to their work. And if this were to reflect a national security strategy, mention or directive to do so, the Department of Defense would address it through its own strategic documentation, and we could get a greater return on investment. It's being done in a decentralized fashion. There are many things that are being done, but they haven't been coordinated. It hasn't been applied universally across all of our combatant commands, for example. And I think improvements can be made.
Let me just ask a follow-up question to you. Is the Department of Defense, you talk about that they have done some things in terms of global climate change, but has there been sort of an overall directive in terms of here are all the things that you can do to make your buildings more energy effective? When you build new buildings, this is what you need to do. I know the number of vehicles you have trying to cut down on clearly using oil, gas. But is there a department or people at the top level saying, we have to do this? Okay.
Not that I know of, Madam Chairman. And I think, though,
But it would be a good idea.
Yes, ma'am, I agree. And I think that it takes a certain amount of time for these new strategic issues to take hold in the security community. Dr. Lennon pointed out that this is the focus on the security dimensions of climate change is rather recent.
Right.
The CNA military advisory report that General Sullivan chaired was only brought out in June. The NIE on climate change and security hasn't been published yet. So these are drivers that bring the attention of people in key leadership positions so that they will begin to consider it and apply it across the board. But at this point, to my knowledge, there isn't anything that speaks to climate change in an overarching fashion in the Department of Defense.
Thank you. Dr. Lennon, the draft of the chapter by John Podesta and Peter Ogden on which your testimony concentrates declares inevitable that A1B greenhouse gas emissions scenario of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a scenario that includes massive food and water shortages, devastating natural disasters, and deadly disease outbreaks. The draft chapter further states that there is no foreseeable political or technological solution that will enable us to avert the majority of the climate impacts projected in the IPCC scenario. If this is so, what are we to do and where do we begin?
As you mentioned, the work that John Podesta and Peter Ogden had done focused in part on the consequences over the next 30 years. And in that time in the generation, from our interaction with scientists that work with the committee, one of the things that surprised me was their advice that essentially over that period of time, we know what is likely to come about. It could be even worse than that if you get these negative or positive feedback effects, ironically titled, that Jim Woolsey spoke about this morning. I think it's likely that those will come about based on the science coming in. One of the sort of clashes of the communities that we found in our study was that a lot of the national security community was frustrated with how cautious the scientific community was, obviously, or somewhat ironically, because they wanted the scientific community to give more definitive answers, which someone in a position of government would require from their staff, even in imperfect information, which is what the national security community is used to dealing with. The scientific community didn't have that pressure, so they didn't face that. That, I think, was the presumption behind Podesta and Ogden, and I don't want to speak for them, but behind their assessment that it was inevitable and that it may be even worse than the IPCC assessment because of the natural cautiousness built into the scientific community in a consensus-driven process, as opposed to those in the national security community that are used to working with imperfect information and what to do about it. Now, the answer to the question what to do about it, frankly, goes beyond the scope of what we did in the project. We essentially peeled off the front end of whether it's occurring and the back end of what to do about it. But it did raise consequences that brought concern to the national security community in a way that the project was designed to try and raise the issues and what they should begin to be thinking about, rather than what to do about it as quickly as possible.
Dr. Price-Smith, are there policy measures beside those designated, are there policy measures beside those designed to arrest or reverse climate change itself that can help forestall or mitigate the effects of the changes in disease, incident, and prevalence that are likely to result from that?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Yeah, that's an interesting question. What can we do in terms of policy? If I can, before I answer that, if I can return to your prior question on evidence, and then we can proceed from there into the policy realm. I've been thinking about it a little bit more, and in fact, there's considerable data now coming out of Bangladesh, and what the epidemiologists, what the scientific community has been doing is using the El Nino Southern Oscillation effect to model long-term climate change, but to truncate it temporally and to measure the short-term changes and try to project from them the impacts on infectious disease. And what Rodo and others have found is that in Bangladesh, a lot of diseases, in fact, correlate very highly with El Nino Southern Oscillation changes. Similarly, in Peru, there's evidence as well that diarrheal diseases and other intestinal diseases respond to changes in winter temperatures. And again, this is a very nascent field, and I'm a political scientist, so it's unusual that I'm speaking on those issues. But as the evidence accumulates, we'll be able to provide you with far better answers as to how these things may be correlated. Now, what I am actually proposing in terms of a policy measure is, A, we need to establish these empirical links. Are these empirical links, in fact, generalizable around the world? To do that, what would need to happen is that Congress or another body might establish a task force on this issue, and we would actually go out and measure these changes in epidemiological indicators such as vectors and pathogens. And this would involve the formation of an interdisciplinary team of researchers, including epidemiologists, economists, political scientists, and so forth, to see, all right, how did these changes occur and what are the consequences in a short span of time for those territories. And we could do that. In terms of policy measures, once we've established that, in fact, these correlations hold over the globe, sure, there are some things we can do. We can, in fact, ask the WHO to reprioritize its budgetary expenditures, because for a long, long time, the WHO has been fixated upon chronic illnesses and not necessarily upon infectious diseases. And so I suggest that we might approach the WHO and say, look, we would like you to target a little more funding towards areas X, Y, and Z in the realm of pathogens. Additional policy measures, I think that funding USAID and its initiatives to deal with diseases like malaria, dengue, diarrheal diseases, and so forth is excellent, but should continue perhaps at a greater level. So I would advocate that. And in general, I think that the U.S. federal government needs to be more cognizant of the role that disease plays in instability throughout the developing world. If you look at a Mercator projection map of the planet, you will notice that most of the industrialized nations in the world happen to be in the temperate zones and not in the tropical regions. And as many historians of public health have argued, such as Alfred Crosby and William McNeill, they said there is a correlation between the burden of disease in the tropics and not only the economic underdevelopment of those societies, but also perhaps the political stability of those regions, or the political instability of those regions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lennon, in your written testimony, you predicted that the United States will often be sought as a global first responder to the immediate aftermath of a major natural disaster or humanitarian emergency. What should be the limits of U.S. participation, And are there mechanisms either existing or yet to be created whereby such responsibility might be shared? Should the United States develop a policy regarding its fulfillment of this role, or is it inevitable that this will be determined on a case-by-case basis?
Thank you. I think it's both inevitable that the U.S. will be sought for its assistance in response to a disaster, primarily because the U.S. military is the only one capable of pulling off the size of an operation that would be required in some of these cases, as it was after the tsunami in the Indian Ocean in 2004. But I also think that in some cases, the United States will want to step up to that role in its position as a global leader. There is no question that there are limits to what the United States should do. I would probably phrase those as guidelines that should guide U.S. responses. If there are incidents in some countries, not only would the U.S. may not want to respond to it, but it may be the case that those countries wouldn't accept responses from the United States if there are particularly bad relations with that country. It may be an opportunity to improve relations with those countries, at least by offering assistance, but it's unlikely to be accepted for political reasons within those countries, in a couple of examples. Again, the institutions that exist, I think, are less formal and more, if not ad hoc, then they're more informal. In the Asian cases, I think we have had the informal cooperation that was quickly sought from other countries such as Japan, India, Australia, possibly South Korea, that could serve as an informal regional actor to be able to respond to the demands of any crisis in the region. I think if something were to happen in Europe or the Middle East, the European Union would seek to respond sometimes by themselves, sometimes in cooperation with the U.S., depending on the demands. And to directly answer your question, I think there's no question that some of the responses is going to have to be made up as we go along, based on the severity of the consequences themselves. But we could go further in developing the types of guidelines to understand the size of the operations that would require the U.S. help and the political benefits as well as risks of doing so in those cases.
Yes, Dr. Butts.
I wondered if I might add to that.
Absolutely.
The Department of Defense has security cooperation programs through its regional combatant commanders to deal with the militaries in their regions and build their capacities. And their capacities quite often, as it relates to climate change and environmental security, has to do with the issue of disaster response and preparedness. We quite often try to, we meaning Department of Defense or the military, try to reach out to regional security organizations, ASEAN or the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is the military element of that, to see if they might take a leading role in encouraging that type of response so that it doesn't require the United States to come back and be the lead agent in each instance. So the Pacific Command, for example, developed a multinational planning augmentation team, the MPAT, that drafted and worked with regional countries to draft a multinational disaster response SOP that deals with these types of issues. And then through their exercises every year, Cobra Gold, for example, that's held in Thailand, they train against those new SOPs and reinforce that. By focusing the guidance from Department of Defense to the regional combatant commanders on these types of issues, putting wording in there that encourages them to do more, we can strengthen those regional organizations and strengthen the military element of power within many of these developing countries and use what is almost always the best resourced agency within those governments to address that humanitarian dimension of climate change or other natural disasters.
I would like to buttress my comments to your further question, your prior question. And one thing that I think we might also do in terms of policy measures is that we might focus on social ingenuity and not necessarily technical ingenuity. Now, in this society, we have a proclivity to focus on technological silver bullets and quick fixes and new vaccines and so forth, when the reality is dealing with infectious agents across the world, we might want to look at social relationships and changing patterns of behavior, particularly in terms of dealing with viruses. The reason being that viruses don't respond to antibiotics, as we all know. And so a great historical example comes from the 1918 influenza, which I've been doing a lot of work on recently. And one of the best ways of dealing with pandemic influenza is not to go hunting for a vaccine or to rely upon Tamiflu, but rather to engage in what we call social distancing. In other words, people were told, don't go to movie theaters, do not go to ball games, and so forth. All right, voluntary quarantine. And one of the best social measures that existed at the time was, in fact, the civil defense associations that had been formed in response to the war, the First World War. And those civil defense associations went out and actually enabled communities to deal with that pandemic from a grassroots level. Now, similarly, you might say, okay, well, in terms of malaria, we need bed nets and we need various other forms of prophylaxis. But one thing that disturbs me is there is a perennial focus upon technical ingenuity and money when it comes to dealing with global health issues. And there is almost never a serious focus upon involving social measures and social scientists in terms of dealing with issues of contagion. And I think that really needs to be addressed. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank all of our witnesses. You did a terrific job in, again, bringing us a little different perspective on global warming. I appreciate all of your comments. Changes in Arctic ice, drought in Africa, contributing to wildfire. These are real contemporary events that our witnesses suggest are a mere foreshadowing of what the world will come over the coming century. The witnesses have articulated the threats very clearly. They have offered some suggestions for action that may contribute to the mitigation of global warming. But this is just a start. We need to better understand the full range of global warming consequences. We also need to work harder to build support for positive steps. Again, thank you for your time. I hope you will continue to engage with the committee and with Congress. I think you have a lot to offer, a lot to contribute, and hopefully we will see some changes made. So again, thank you very much for your time.